sing you a song, try not to sing out of key. Oh, I get by with a little help from my friends. I get high with a little help from my friends. Gonna try with a little help from my friends. What do I do when my love is away? Does it worry to be alone? How do I feel by the end of the day? I get sad because you're on your own. No, I get by with a little help from my friends. Yeah, I get high with a little help from my friends. Gonna try with a little help from my friends. Do you need anybody? I need somebody to love. Could it be anybody? Just want someone to love.
Kellye McBride is a freelance writer, editor, and film instructor from the Portland area. She is a graduate of the University of Oregon, where her undergraduate studies led to a degree in philosophy. She continued her studies at Kingston University, where she earned an MA in contemporary European philosophy. She currently serves as the TV editor for the UK horror blog, Sublime Horror, and has written for numerous film publications, including Rue Morgue magazine, Scream magazine, and Horror Homeroom. She was published in Stephen King and philosophy. Her short nonfiction recently was nominated for the Bram Stoker Awards by the Horror Writers Association. Today, Kellye will be speaking to us about dismantling white privilege, how whites can become better allies. Kellye?
Thank you so much, Stephen. And thank you to our lovely musicians this morning. That was excellent. So white privilege is a very uncomfortable topic for undoubtedly for many of you. How many are kind of maybe sweating a little bit? Maybe feeling like, yeah, this is maybe something a little bit out of my comfort zone. That's okay. We're going to be kind of addressing the discomfort as well as maybe some of the feelings and the policies kind of maybe and structures sort of motivating those discomforts. So we're gonna kind of incorporate a holistic approach, but kind of how I wanted to start off, because typically when we're talking about uncomfortable topics, it's very easy to get in this kind of like grip, stressed mindset where you're feeling like defensive and maybe you're not listening so much to what is being said and you're kind of like in your own kind of bubble. So I just want to kind of lead everybody into maybe just taking a deep breath before we begin, and everybody maybe breathe in through your nose, hold it, and breathe out through your mouth and release. And the reason, and I'm going to come back to this a little bit too, the reason we do this is so that we're kind of focusing on, you know, the content of what I'm going to be talking about, and not so much maybe what might be spiraling through your head right now. Because a lot of the times when we're talking about white privilege for us white people, you know, it might come up with stuff that we have said or done in the past, or maybe previous beliefs that we've had before we've kind of thought a little bit more about kind of where we're coming from, or maybe from a place of ignorance. And so it's common for you to maybe see yourself sometimes in a negative view that might not be conducive to actually participating in the conversation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this more. I know this sounds kind of vague right now, but so what I'm going to do is I have slides. So as I'm talking, I'm going to have like little bullet points just to sort of illustrate what illustrate my points here. So you can kind of just listen to the sound of my voice and sort of be guided along the presentation. Okay, so we already kind of talked about leaving questions till the end. But I want to talk a little bit more about the content of maybe some of those questions, and maybe we should kind of commit to using I statements. And I statements are good because, whoops. Okay, so why do we use I statements? So white privilege and whiteness can be difficult to talk about, and it's important that we respect each other in the process wherever we're at in our learning journey. So using I statements is good in order to frame observations so we don't sound like we're attacking other people. So like I feel versus you are. It's just a way of communicating with each other where we can kind of respect where everybody is at kind of in their own journey of talking about their privilege. So it's important to call out behavior and not people. So this is meant to be a non-judgmental space. So we are going to talk more about behaviors and kind of how those behaviors might impact people. And we're not going to use it as a platform to shame or denounce people. Sometimes in these conversations when things get heated, again, when we're in that kind of stressed, grip state, we might be tempted to, you know, call out other people as a means of kind of distracting from maybe where we're at in our own feelings. And it's just not really a productive way of having a conversation. So it's just something to keep in mind as we're going along. So when talking about race among white people, there's a couple of barriers that get in the way of us sort of talking about the problem as a systemic issue, and it tends to be framed more in terms of it as an interpersonal issue. And I will speak a little bit more about this later, but some of these barriers are, so first of all, a misunderstanding of white privilege. So white privilege was originally conceived as a tool for understanding invisible power structures versus as a way to provoke white guilt. A lot of people think, well, it's just a way of like subtly or like attacking white people, and versus actually as a means of understanding how white people tend to have some unearned advantages within society that probably could use some further examination. Another barrier is kind of silence around the current state of race relations and police brutality in the United States. So when white privilege is abused, people of color often suffer the consequences. And a lot of the times too, it's a lack of understanding of progressive terminology. You might hear phrases like woke being thrown around. You have no idea what that means. That can also maybe hinder your confidence as far as talking about race. So there's a couple of things. This is by no means a comprehensive list of everything that prevents white people from talking about white privilege, but these are three very common issues that might halt or derail a conversation. So when we're talking about white privilege, it's really important to understand what it is we're exactly talking about. So white privilege was actually a term coined by scholar Peggy McIntosh in her 1989 essay, White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. I can link the essay a little bit later, but it was geared towards examining the invisible ways in which white people enjoy unearned advantages simply by being born white in this country. So these were all kind of framed as I statements. And it's just a list of like various things that maybe white people take for granted that people of color don't necessarily have or enjoy that same experience. So for example, I can, if I wish, arrange to be in the company of people of my race most of the time. The intention behind the essay was to inspire self-reflection and enhance empathy and compassion, according to The Atlantic, as well as to start a dialogue about racial equity in the United States. And I think it's pretty common on college campuses and activist groups. That's where I first learned about this essay. And it's a very good tool because it's very concrete. We're not talking about very abstract concepts. We're kind of talking about, you know, everyday lived experience. So it's a really, really helpful essay. And again, it's easy to kind of look at dialogues about white privilege and then maybe make some assumptions about what it is or what it isn't. So maybe it's good to quickly summarize what white privilege is not. So it's not a way for white people to feel guilty or shameful about themselves for having been born white. It's not a vast conspiracy concocted by people of color to solicit oppression points and garner sympathy by the national news media. And it's not a convenient way to disguise an ad hominem attack. For example, you're just a privileged white male, or dismiss somebody you don't like. So again, white privilege is about these kind of invisible power structures, not personal feelings. Although personal feelings are going to be a factor that maybe hinders talking about white privilege, as I have said before. Okay, I want to address the idea of white guilt for a minute, because I think white guilt is something that comes up a lot and often in relation to discussions about white privilege. And I sort of want to investigate, you know, where these thoughts tend to come from, and maybe thinking about reframing them a little bit, because, you know, it's, as a white person, you know, it can be difficult to hear some of these things, especially things that people of color have told us that, you know, put ourselves maybe in a negative light, and then feel like, oh my gosh, you know, I'm complicit in these systems. I don't know what to do. And then you kind of get trapped in this feedback loop of white guilt, and you're not quite sure how to address the problem. So the lines along how these thoughts are formed kind of come out as something like this. So we have a first premise: as a white person, I enjoy many unfair advantages simply by being born white. Goes to the second premise: an ethical person neither benefits from unfair advantages at best, nor do they tolerate cruelty. And the conclusion we can kind of draw from this is that therefore it is impossible to be white and ethical at the same time, which kind of goes along the same lines of distorted thinking. And we're going to address this and think about the ways of maybe reframing some of these thoughts that you might be having. So how to work through white guilt. So first, it's really important to resist the temptation to personalize it. Whiteness thrives on turning a systemic problem into an interpersonal issue. So it's important to note that you are one among many millions of white people today alive who must shoulder that responsibility. The goal of deconstructing whiteness is not about blame, but accountability. And you'll hear activists talk about accountability a lot. And it's important to remember that, you know, people of color holding us accountable for our actions really is an act of love. it's a means of stopping these kind of systemic cycles of violence and really changing the world for the better. So that's an important thing to keep in mind, especially if you're thinking about, your own white privilege and you're getting kind of defensive, is that accountability really is the way that we end this stuff, not assigning blame or, feeling bad for being white. That's not helpful. It's not productive. And the first way to sort of address that is acceptance. So accept that there may have been a time in your life when you said or did something racist. You might not have intended to do so, but racism is so ingrained in whiteness, it's near impossible not to have done so. And the only way to heal is through radical acceptance and by forgiving yourself. So I want to talk a little bit about forgiveness. Forgiveness does not excuse the action. It doesn't serve as a cop-out for future racist behavior, I don't think it's really being soft or enabling anybody, but rather it's an opportunity to allow the white person to let go of harmful feelings while committing to positive change. And it's really, really crucial to stress that this is something you have to do for yourself. You cannot go to your Black friends and ask them for forgiveness. That's not going to work, first of all. Second of all, even if, a person of color came up to you and was like, man, I forgive you, it's not going to change the situation. Like, these are your feelings. You have to deal with them. You have to work through them. So consider a gift that you can give yourself, as well as a call for future responsibility. And, you can even do it through like a guided meditation or journaling. But I would really encourage you, if you feel like you're getting defensive, or you feel like you're getting stuck in this feedback loop of white guilt, to really just sit down and address it head on. So I came up with this kind of little guided meditation that you can do for yourself when you have some time, just away from other people. So find a quiet, comfortable place free of distractions where you can sit undisturbed for about 15 to 20 minutes. Close your eyes and draw your attention to your breath. Inhale through the nose, hold for 5 seconds, and exhale through the mouth and release for 5 seconds. Repeat for 5 to 10 breaths. So once you are in that relaxed state, I want you to think of a time when either you got called out for something racist, or you said or did something you regret. This is going to depend significantly based on the individual person. And also to notice the emotions kind of welling up in your body and any defensive thoughts that might be running through your head, like, oh, it was just a joke. I didn't mean it like that. Accept the fact that you made a mistake and just reflect on how you could have acted differently. Make a commitment to change in the future, and then forgive yourself for being human and just let it go. So I would really encourage you to really work through your feelings too before you're going into, spaces where you're working alongside other activists of color, and just making sure that you are taking care of your own feelings separately before diving in and trying to help other people, because sometimes, constantly doing things or constantly trying to, take action and stuff like that can be a way of distancing ourselves from our feelings and distancing ourselves from maybe some uncomfortable truths you've been hiding about yourself. And it's really, really important to just kind of sit with it and sort of gauge where you're at, and just make a commitment to working on that, as well as taking, greater political action. So it's a both and. I don't think, just working on your feelings or just taking action is one is better than the other, but I think you kind of need both of them in order to, fully address the problem and kind of figure out where you're fitting into this. All right, so in sum, white privilege is something that you have, and it's not something that you are. It's not an identity. Therefore, it is something that you can absolutely deal with. It's just really important to make that distinction. So when we ignore our privilege, when we ignore kind of the ways in which, we might have unintentionally benefited from systems of oppression, um, privilege allows for beneficiaries to operate under a certain level of ignorance and comfort. So you might have heard, you may be familiar with the phrase "silence is complicity," maybe being tossed around on social media or within activist spaces, and this is exactly what it's pointing to. So unless somebody becomes deliberately aware of their privilege, it can be really hard to even broach the subject of race relations, because privilege acts as a certain set of social blinders for those who benefit. However, it's really important to note that even privileged people can use their position for good, and it's not always a precursor to bigotry. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what ignorance is versus bigotry, because I think the two terms tend to get conflated, and ignorance can definitely lead to bigotry, but it's not, it doesn't mean that ignorant people are automatically bigoted. There's kind of, there's varying levels of sort of where you can fit along the scale. So ignorant people might say or do similar things to bigoted people, but the difference lies within the intention of the person. And this is kind of, in order to figure out, where the difference exactly is, you're going to have to sort of just use your discernment. An ignorant person, upon learning new information and becoming aware of their own personal biases, will usually drop problematic beliefs or behaviors and change. All an ignorant person usually needs is a trusted friend or mentor to take them aside and to talk to them about why their actions are harmful. And in contrast, a bigot doesn't necessarily care whether or not their words or actions are harming the other person. In fact, they may be deliberately enjoying provoking the other party because it gives them a perverse kind of ego boost. They are unlikely to change even when presented with new information, because they are more concerned with optics than with empathy. And I'm going to want to talk about Donald Trump for a second, because I think a lot of us, are thinking about this too, if we're watching the news and kind of seeing how our president is behaving in the face of these issues. So a significant portion of news media is devoted to Trump's antics, some of which is useful because his administration has done a lot of damage in terms of his policy changes, and a lot of the groundwork for addressing police brutality under the Obama administration was swiftly dismantled upon his election in 2016, Trump's election, I should say. In order to address the harmful effects of a Trump presidency, more conscious attention should be made to his policies and to what he is actually doing. That said, attempts to psychoanalyze Trump or reason with him are futile at best and distracting at worst. It's safe to say that he's a bigot who is more concerned with his self-image rather than the well-being of the American people, and should be managed rather than reasoned with. And the reason I talk about this is because, in discussing ignorance versus bigotry, I know somebody's going to say, well, what about Donald Trump? And this is kind of where I've sort of placed him along the line of ignorant versus bigoted, because he has had several opportunities and people who have tried to reason with him, and he just seems to rebuke any efforts in the meantime. So that's what I'll say. This is, again, we're talking about, how people who generally already want to change can address white privilege and racism in their communities, not trying to goad the president into becoming a better person. All right. So I want to shift gears a little bit, because chances are, if you're already kind of aware of, the George Floyd protests and Black Lives Matter and, the issues that are happening right now in the news and on social media, you probably run across certain arguments that are leveled online. And I want to talk about those for a bit, because I think there's a lot of back and forth that happens and not much of an explanation of why certain people hold certain opinions. And I kind of want to just sort of unpack what people are saying and thinking a little bit more in depth, and try to figure out, where people are coming from. this sounds very vague, but I assure you this that the things I'm going to be talking about are very specific. So you probably heard somebody say, for instance, like, it's not my job to educate you. So this argument is usually directed at white people who constantly ask activists of color what can be done to address racism. So it's important to note that there are literally thousands of books, blogs, and articles that address how racism can be remedied in the private sphere, branches of government, and even in the entertainment industry. So a simple Google search will bring up millions of hits at the click of a button. So when someone says it's not my job to educate you, what it really is pointing towards is gently placing the responsibility back on the white person or persons to seek out educational resources themselves rather than rely on people of color to just automatically produce them when asked, which is kind of rude if you think about it. Like, I mean, if somebody came up to me on the street and been like, what are like the 10 best books about race that you know? I mean, I swear I would just like draw a blank and be like, I don't know, go away. So it's sort of a gentle reminder of like, just don't put people on the spot, particularly activists of color. They're tired, they're overworked. Just it's totally within your wheelhouse to sort of seek out educational resources and opportunities by yourself. And I would encourage all of you to do so, especially. I mean, God, I was like on an interior design site this morning and they had like, 50 Black businesses that you can support right now. I mean, people are producing a lot of content speaking to this particular issue. So it's not that hard to find. All right, you probably have heard somebody at some point, talk about all lives matter or blue lives matter in response to Black lives matter. And what's the difference? So all lives matter is a slogan that has been levied against the Black Lives Matter movement, claiming that it is not inclusive enough of all races or even law enforcement. Some proponents even go as far to say that Black Lives Matter is racist because of its specificity. So the origin of this type of argument it's similar to colorblind theories of race that insist that we are all of one race as human beings. But it's important to note that all lives matter does nothing to address the fact that people of color face a disproportionate amount of police violence when compared to white people. So again, it's really important to remember that white lives or blue lives, etc., aren't the ones under threat right now. Black lives are. So what All Lives Matter really does is reduces the problem of systemic violence against people of color to an individual problem. And again, it's sort of like what I was talking about earlier, where a lot of the times, like, ignorant or bigoted people will try to talk about things individually, as in racism is an interpersonal issue versus a systemic one. And really what Black Lives Matter is trying to show that it's disproportionately impacting and targeting one group of people for no good reason at all. Like, it's really their community is constantly being under threat. So what it comes down to is really taking the time to think with empathy and compassion, and thinking it systemically versus taking it personally when somebody calls you out or somebody is trying to explain the problem. Okay, you might have heard this one before. I don't want kindness, I want justice. So you might have read or heard this in an op-ed, a speech, or a Facebook post by a person of color commenting on George Floyd's murder at the hands of police. So from a white perspective, this seems confusing because at first glance, it seems like kindness is the noun to focus on here, but really the emphasis is on justice. So this points to the futility and frustration that people of color have had to endure as they have had to advocate for their own experiences and needs, but no real progress has been made. So from their perspective, it sounds like when white allies offer their condolences or their thoughts and prayers, it can seem like an insincere attempt to smooth things over, and then the status quo is still maintained. So maybe you've had a friend who like constantly apologizes repeatedly, but then they make the same mistake over and over again. It's a little bit like that. It comes off as tone deaf, and it doesn't necessarily address the problem. It's just sort of a way for, um, so again, it's gently placing the responsibility back on white people to deal with their feelings and stuff separately, and to focus and commit to fixing the problem of systemic racism in America. Okay, you might have heard this one. I don't support the protests because of looting. So we can all agree that small businesses whose livelihoods suffer because of property damage, that's bad. However, looting or rioting are both terms that suspiciously tend to get tossed around when there's any type of civil disobedience involving people of color. Oftentimes, references to looting is a convenient excuse to denounce public displays of anger by people of color without expressing the sentiment directly. So you got to remember, bigotry is about optics. It's about looking like a good person, even if your acts and behaviors don't necessarily support that. So, however, if you do care about the death of George Floyd and you're worried about property damage, here's some perspective. The majority of looters in this instance were members of white supremacist groups trying to undermine the protesters and start a race war, which for some reason they call Boogaloo. The businesses targeted were often corporate chains who will probably recover financially. And a lot of the protesters who witnessed property damage of small businesses are working to collect donations and help with repairs. Besides, it's really important to remember that property can be replaced, but people are irreplaceable. We're really concerned with, the sanctity and value of Black life right now. We can always have another Target or Williams Sonoma or whatever store in question has been, damaged or something like that. All right. So this is a question that gets tossed around a lot. So how to use your privilege for good, or the concept of, using your privilege to support people of color versus using it kind of as a social blinder. So one thing to think about, since privilege is a form of power, you might think of ways in which you have power or influence in your communities. So maybe you run a nonprofit or work in a law firm. If you're retired, then time is your greatest asset. Ditto goes for money if you're wealthy, and donations are always needed. So also don't be afraid to discount communities you were formerly a part of, such as the corporate network. Start to think about ways wherever you have influence. Maybe brainstorm some ideas of where racism or lack of diversity might need to be addressed or advocated for. So for example, if you are involved in local politics, simply showing up and advocating for policy change around police departments will help your communities of color, especially if you used to work in law enforcement yourself. So it's important to note that it's not a one-size-fits-all solution, and it requires all kinds of help. So protesting and direct action, as well as policy change, getting, communities to talk and be open about racial equity. So if you're struggling to come up with, even something, even talking to other white people about race is really helpful. So you got to think about it. Is your racist cousin on Facebook more likely to listen to you as a family member or a complete stranger? This requires a little bit of imagination and ingenuity, but then it's also important to note that there are activists right now who are coming up with concrete ways to change and fix the solution, and they just need support. So just kind of thinking of ways of where you can be a supportive influence, show up for your communities. Is really helpful. And I want to leave you with one last thought, that you don't need to reinvent the wheel. You don't need to solve racism. You just need to take action. And taking the kind of action that will actually benefit people of color and not just yourself or your feelings of guilt. So it's kind of a twofer. You have to address your own interior emotions, but also find a way where you can kind of get out and help, your community, and making sure that help is the kinds of help people actually need. So it takes some humility and grace. And it's not kind of an overnight process, and it's a process that is going to have to be continuous. You know, once the protest ends, we still have to work on these types of things. You know, it doesn't just go away. It's a continuous way of acting and engagement with the world that we're going to have to be committed to if we really want to see some real positive change. So I want to thank all of you for me talking for, goodness, 45 minutes. And I'm going to stop here and maybe open this up to some questions. So what sources are you using to determine that the majority of looters were members of white supremacist groups? So I don't have a plethora of articles available on hand. I know just when I was watching like MSNBC, they were talking about it a little bit. And I think Huffington Post and New York Times maybe covered this issue, but I don't have facts and statistics on hand, so this is going to have to be something that either you research or I research and get back to you on.
I've been active off and on with the Portland branch of the NAACP for the past 20 years or so, so I've definitely recognized white privilege for a long time. And one thing I do in my home-based business, home inspections, is I give a 25% discount to African Americans, Native Americans, immigrants, and refugees. And I was told by realtors that this is illegal because it's just discriminatory towards race. And an impression I got from the civil rights legislation of the 1960s is that, okay, now we can't discriminate about race, so we're all equal, and now let's go on living our lives now that we're all equal. Well, the problem is we still aren't equal in our situations. And so my point or comment is that we really need to get beyond that non-discrimination. We need to discriminate positively for some races in order to get more equality or equity.
Yeah, no, I would definitely agree. It might be helpful too. I don't know, just based on what kind of information out there, like, are there any particular barriers that communities of color have in terms of home inspection? Have there been like case studies where home inspectors maybe refuse to, you know, work with houses of or households of color in the past or something like that? Or you know, you could talk about property and zoning laws where maybe communities of color might not have the same access that white families do in terms of getting home inspection, getting like the types of things they need in terms of, you know, just basic like home maintenance and stuff like that. So maybe it takes some like research and kind of presenting the case like, actually, you know, this is a problem that has disproportionately affected one group, a bunch of groups of people versus one. So maybe it might just take some education and information in order for them to change the policy, but sounds like you're doing great work.
Well, I still do civil disobedience in that way.
That's good. That's awesome. We need more of that.
There was a comment from Wayne. I think the question is this the tipping point towards civil war?
Well, white supremacist groups certainly want that to happen. I don't know why. I think it has to do with some, there's a great series of YouTube videos. It's called the Alt-Right Playbook. And I would really encourage watching this series because it really comprehensively goes through step by step sort of the mindset of these far right groups, and sort of how they think, which, you know, I've never really considered or thought to be useful before, but it actually contextualizes a lot of sort of the problems and how they see it, and kind of frames, you know, maybe what it's like for the other side. So I think the idea behind like sort of the race war is that white supremacists tend to think of human society and human nature in particular as a kind of hierarchy, and that war and struggle is natural and necessary. So basically they want this to happen because it reaffirms, you know, their own use and abuse of power, for some like perverse reason. The video series explains it a lot better than I just did, but it has some great insights as far as like how this tends to happen, how and why, you know, they think this way. And so I would encourage everyone to watch it.
Kellye, there was a comment from Jill again.
Mm-hmm.
About I've been trying to research the role of hate groups and in looting and destruction, and have seen it with the Proud Boys here in Portland, but still have friends in the Midwest who say it's Antifa. I think, you know, trying just to get at how do you argue those so strongly held beliefs?
Right. Yeah, that's a challenging one. And you might have more luck too. I mean, I know I keep saying, you know, this is a systemic issue. This is a systemic issue. But you might also try to think about too, like, why do these people want it to be Antifa? Why, why are they so invested in the idea that Antifa must be the bad guys in this situation? You know, I don't have like facts and statistics off the top of my head in order to address this question, but maybe if they're not responding with logic, chances are there's sort of an emotional or maybe a reinforcing belief behind that is being triggered here. So maybe, you know, wanting it to be Antifa, they wouldn't have to think about, you know, maybe why the protesters have a point. Maybe it's a way of distancing from the idea of protests as being, you know, like necessary or something that maybe everyone should consider. So it depends on the person or persons involved in that situation. But I've found that a lot of defensiveness and resistance to ideas, usually there's some other reason besides just a political reason that might be reinforcing that, because if someone's really clinging to an idea, then that idea must really have some type of sway on them. So something to think about.
That's a really good point. Thank you. Stephen Kroll had a comment or question.
Yeah, I read recently a statement by the Portland Business Alliance deploring the looting that's taken place. And in the opening paragraph, they have a comment, our gratitude, our thanks, and our solidarity are with those community leaders who, in the wake of the tragic loss of George Floyd's life, call our community together. And I want to contrast that description of why the rioting took place from something that I've read, say, in the Christian Science Monitor. They again talk about the protests, and I quote, ignited by the death of George Floyd under a policeman's knee in Minneapolis. Now, I think the difference between those statements is a deliberate way to distract people's appropriate response to George Floyd's death and the cause of the riots. And I'm curious, as I think through this, I wonder how can one respond to an organization like the Portland Business Alliance, to this, I think, anodyne and useless description of a really tragic event.
Yeah, again, this has to deal with defensiveness, and that's a lot of why we have like these barriers around our conversations, because it's something, there's something invested in not admitting, you know, that this was a tragedy. So maybe understanding why it might not be beneficial for them to admit this or admit a wrong. Maybe, yeah, what was I thinking about? Yeah, it maybe, you know, understanding, you know, rioting is like kind of a natural response to grief. Maybe, you know, admitting that, you know, everyone is grieving and that people of color have been grieving a long time. You know, there's 400 years of grieving that kind of needs to happen in order for healing and closure, or maybe like a misunderstanding of like what the real purpose of grief is. So yeah, I think maybe distracting, or like these euphemisms that you hear people use all the time, where it's sort of like, well, it's about this, but it's really about this. You just kind of need to dig deeper and be like, well, why is this important over this thing? And just kind of really maybe poking around and maybe asking some questions like, well, okay, say, you know, you're upset about the looting. Can you be upset about the looting, but also be really upset about the death of George Floyd? You know, it doesn't have to be like one or the other. It can be a both and you can, you know, express disdain for property damage, but also be very invested in human life and be outraged and, you know, angry about what happened. I mean, it's you kind of need both in order to be a whole person. So maybe it's a matter of like asking questions and maybe provoking more thoughtful engagement might lead to better results. Or I mean, yeah, it depends. And again, this is like also the difference too between ignorance and bigotry. You know, some people, they want to change, but they're hesitant to, or they, you know, feel like if they give up on their particular situation or they're wrong about something, then that means they're wrong as a person. So that's why they cling to beliefs. But other times, you know, maybe they sincerely believe that, you know, this is not what we should be focusing on. So it's a matter of discernment. And I think discernment and asking questions and really thoughtful engagement is really what's going to kind of break through the silence versus, you know, just arguing back and forth about this is my position, this is my position. So hopefully that answered your question.
Yeah, well, what I'm really thinking of is, how do you respond to the Portland Business Alliance? I can write them a letter.
Yeah.
And you know, that might be useful. But the institutional view of this event that's presented here is ignores an essential feature. And I guess that's what I should say to them. But it's particularly disturbing to see organizations like this who step back from the core issue, which happens to be police violence in this case, for their convenience. And it's just disturbing, that's all.
You can write that in the letter too. You express that, like, that's 100% valid to consider. And, you know, maybe extending the opportunity, like, maybe you can do better. Here's how.
Kellye, this is Al Christians. Helen stepped away so I could ask you my question.
Sure.
When you were talking about kindness versus justice, you said, well, justice is a systemic issue. On the other side of it, kindness is thought of as more of an individual virtue. And so you have the dichotomy here of the individual attitudes, the individual feelings, the individual knowledge and beliefs, and ability to see what's really going on versus the systemic oppression. I guess some people say that oppression is always systemic. And I say that, well, yes, but the beliefs in the man in the street's brain always have to be consistent with the system, or else the system would fail. So the system finds there's some way that there's an equilibrium between individual beliefs and systemic power, and they support each other. They've got to be together. And that gives us, I guess, a lot of us, perhaps white people who want to deal with this thing, well, it's hopeless. You try to change individual beliefs and you can't, because the system makes it impossible. You try to change the system, you can't do that because the individual beliefs make it impossible. Now, you had this same thing of either or, you got to do both. You were just talking about with Steve. Do you think that it's true that we have to do both? That we can't act in just either as a kind individual or as an agitator for systemic change, that we have to do both in order to do the right thing?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think maybe a way of framing this differently too is that systemic oppression happens to individuals.
Yes.
And responses are often fairly individual, based on your psychology, your upbringing. There are multiple factors that contribute to a person. And so people are going to have like various ways that they cope either with oppression or privilege. It kind of, the reactions and the responses tend to vary across the board. But I also want to talk a little bit about the idea of, addressing systemic issues. Advocating for justice is kindness. And kindness doesn't just always have to be like interpersonal being nice, but kindness sometimes takes a very different shape. And I think that's very hard to understand sometimes, growing up in the United States, where we have like, our regionalisms like Northwest nice, like we always have to be pleasant and nice to each other. Sometimes doing actually the kind thing is political agitation. Sometimes doing the kind thing is to hold the people in your life accountable. Sometimes doing the kind thing is just, maybe holding space for people and their feelings, but subtly pushing them to be better people. So kindness doesn't always take the form that you might think it does, where it's just, we're on the surface level, we're all pleasant to each other. Sometimes kindness really advocates doing the deep, meaningful work where we're really working on repairing and healing relationships. And that doesn't mean, I've witnessed jerks on both sides of the aisle you might have a chip on their shoulder, and you also need to understand like compassion, or just having compassion to people, because you don't know what their personal experiences are. Maybe they've been, really hurt by the impact of systemic violence. So yeah, they're going to be naturally a little crusty. That's just kind of how it is, how we cope. And you might not be able to do anything about that, but you can still advocate for that person and think about ways too. You don't always have to like the individual people involved in the struggle, but you still need to advocate for them and like treat them like human beings, and like, speak out when injustice occurs. So it's a matter of maybe rethinking kindness and thinking kindness as a way of fitting into ways of dismantling systemic forms of oppression.
Okay, I've got one I statement that I want to know if you have a standard explanation or standard response to my I statement. My I statement is, I bought into America, and I see that probably many of the elements of white privilege that I was born with are what I thought work, privileges of American citizens, and I want everybody to have the privileges that I have.
Mm-hmm.
Is that in any sense relevant or irrelevant to the problems that we're having now? What's your response to that? If I just say, I want everybody to have these privileges.
Yeah. So I would assume you're talking about the American dream here.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, the American dream, there's, man, I don't know if I have time to completely address how this concept is functioned for better or for worse, but I think the idea of making sure, like, wanting everybody to kind of to live in the America that you've been brought up in, I think that's great. I think, wanting everyone to wanting those rights and privileges to extend to everybody, I think that's the right idea. But I also a little bit wary about, the idea of the American dream, because originally the American dream was a way of kind of protecting these privileges and securing them for whites only. So within the history of this country, talking about things like manifest destiny, where, white Christian people thought it was their God-given right to expand the United States and take land away from the Native Americans and to buy into slavery and buy into oppression in order to secure a better future. So the concept that wasn't really a feasible reality for everybody. So maybe
I gave a talk to the humanists back about 4 months ago about the 1890s, and I mentioned white manifest destiny in there. So you might want to look at that. It's online.
I think we are at Kathy's question. Should we emphasize that thousands are demonstrating non-violently while only a much smaller number are acting violent or looting? Yes. And again, this is a numbers game. So a lot of the times when we bring up stories of looting or violent behavior, it's maybe to distract from the real intention of, like, what the protests are actually there for. So yeah, that's a great point.
Just to add to that, my apartment overlooks Pioneer Square, and I've seen thousands of people down there behaving very politely. It appears that occasionally a small group may at the end go off, and I think lately they've been going down to where they've got the Justice building cordoned off, and so they are interacting with the police down there. Now, I did get affected by the looting in that I was supposed to have picked up a new computer at the Apple store on Saturday, the day after Apple was looted. But I don't think those people are even, they may be some Antifa, they may be white nationalists. Those are just plain criminals.
Well, and sometimes people use social movements as kind of a guise or cover for, personal.
Yeah, police are busy elsewhere.
And that happens, but yeah, it is a disproportionately smaller group than the people who are out there personal or protesting larger issues. So yeah.
I have a quick question on this, Helen. Sure. The George Floyd's funeral will be Tuesday. People have been marching, and the protests have grown, but I see they can't. I don't believe people can keep going downtown every night for days and days on end. Do you have any thoughts on what's next? I mean, how to keep this movement going when you beyond walking the streets?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think it just comes down to the part of the reason why I wanted to include, maybe like thinking about ways of like using your privilege for good. Just think about ways in which maybe you're influential in a particular community or online or even within your family, and just trying to like think about creative ways to like keep the momentum going. Maybe it's volunteering a little bit of your time each week. Maybe it's you know, supporting local businesses, Black-owned businesses. Maybe it's doing some research and educating yourself, and maybe thinking of, you know, ways you can just incorporate it into your own life. It's kind of, I hate to say this, but it is an individual kind of path toward liberation, where you have to, you know, maybe get a little creative and think about how you fit into the bigger picture. And there's no one size fits all answer, because again, like, probably the protests will burn out at some point, but, you know, the court system won't, probably, or, you know, businesses will not. There are plenty of spaces where that probably could use, you know, a closer look at, you know, questions of racism and diversity and, you know, accountability. And, you know, just taking it a step further. So, I think a lot of people, when they get hung up on the idea of like, well, how do we change? You know, maybe change isn't as radical enough or something like that. Just because, you know, we don't have sweeping changes happening, and, you know, maybe we will. I mean, people are talking about like abolishing police departments altogether. So I need to think about that too. Thinking about, you know, anti-racism as like a praxis is something you are continually doing, or you're continually advocating for. It's sort of like flexing a muscle. You have to sort of keep working on building it and strengthening it, and maybe being kind to yourself. Like, it's not going to happen overnight. You do not have to reinvent the wheel or solve the whole problem in the evening. You probably can't, because we have, again, 400 years of history where all of this stuff is kind of entrenched in sort of how the way we think and feel and act in the world. So it's just going to take some thinking and some time and some patience, and it really comes down to making sure it's a continued effort, and not just like a one and done type of thing.
Thank you. Todd had a question. It looks like, what do you think the specific objectives are now for the demonstrations, and how long do you think the protests will last?
Yes. So I have no idea how long the protests are going to last. That's kind of up to the protesters, honestly. But I think the specific objective being, so probably for the police or police departments to sort of hear what protesters are saying, and to maybe look at the video of George Floyd's death and maybe think about, you know, what are their role in either assisting or maybe undermining Black community or communities of color, and how like things like poverty, for example, affect crime rates. Guaranteed, it might not be all cops on a particular police force, but chances are they know somebody who's maybe has a reputation on the force, or someone who's maybe advocated against the use of excessive or deadly force or been suspended. So this might be a matter of the individual police department we're concerned with, or the local policies, the local government that feeds into that. Again, it kind of deals with specific issues in different cities. But I think the point of sort of the national protests and the national coming together is sort of recognizing that this is a problem and something needs to be done, is mostly what the objective of the demonstrations are. How that gets implemented across the board is going to be very different, but mostly it has to deal with, you know, the death of George Floyd is very upsetting, and it's it's just one example of the systemic violence being brought about communities of color. And so thinking about that on sort of the national scale, but also we want to think about it in terms of the local scale.
Thank you. Can you read Mike Burchett's comment? I deliver mail to downtown Portland. I try to just provide a sympathetic, reasonable voice to my customers as well as my fellow coworkers of color. I want to contribute to the solution without adding excessive noise to the issue.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, being part of the post office, I mean, that probably has some power in the community. Michael, do you serve on any like councils or any like organizations or unions? Okay.
No, I'm kind of, socially awkward myself. So there's times where I've, something falls out of my mouth before I had a chance to say it.
Mm-hmm.
So I do try, if there's other things I can join or subscribe to, I want to be circumspect about what I'm joining.
Yeah, I'm sure there's got to be like, maybe this takes some Googling, but like there's got to be like postal workers against racism or something like that. That group's got to exist.
Yeah, I can talk with my union steward. We have one
Okay.
of the most, unions in the country, the National Association of Letter Carriers.
Perfect.
So, yeah,
That
like,
sounds like a great place to get involved.
yeah, like I said, a lot of my coworkers in the office are of color, Black or Islander or whatever, and I just talk to them as friends about we mentioned these things, and we are so all agreeing about everything that's happening around us, and I just try my best not to go too far, like I'm trying to hijack the issue or something.
Yeah, I think as long as you're like kind of mindful when you're talking, sort of like, am I saying this to make myself feel better, or am I saying this because like I genuinely like feel for the other person and stuff. And sometimes all you just got to do is listen. You don't need to talk at all. But yeah, I think that kind of policy, like maybe getting involved with the union or talking to them or seeing if they have any type of thing in place, that might all be what you need to do.
Yeah, I'll have to look at it, or if I can find the past issues of our newsletters, how they are addressing the George Floyd tragedy and all that. I'm pretty sure that they denounce it emphatically.
Mm-hmm.
Kellye, we had a comment from Jim and Jessica. We would be very sorry if we abolished police departments. And I think I know for myself, I would agree with that as well. Could you talk a little bit about what you know about the defunding, the goal of defunding, or about the police? Yeah.
Yes. So actually, I work surrounding the police. I know there's lots of different programs and policies being tossed around. One person I would really recommend reading or looking into on this issue would be Angela Davis. So she does a lot of work with prison reform and kind of she was a major figure in the Black Power movement kind of in the 70s, but she's also a professor at UC Santa Cruz, professor of philosophy, actually. I went and saw her speak at University of Oregon many years ago. But I think a lot of the work she does now is particularly on this issue. And she might be a good one to look into, because I don't have any facts on hand specifically as to how people are doing this. So this might be just another one of those research things. But I know that I think when people get wary about the idea of abolishing the police or something, is it's not like we just get rid of the police and there's anarchy and like there's no system in place in support of it. I think the way they're trying to either reform or substitute the police is it's more of finding a better way to kind of work with the criminal justice system. So addressing things like that lead to crime, like poverty and drug addiction, and kind of focus on that end of the spectrum. So focus on prevention, making sure people have jobs, making sure, you know, that there's childcare, you know, all of the things that sort of feed into crime, working on that end in order to reduce crime versus just dealing with the effects, dealing with people who, you know, have to steal stuff because they have no other way of getting what they need. So it's a matter of tackling all sides of the issue. So in the case of like violent criminals, they would have some other way of sort of dealing with the issue, maybe some mental health resources, maybe other ways of addressing the problem versus just the traditional, we arrest somebody, we have a trial, we send them to prison, and then kind of the cycle continues. So just thinking outside of the box. This does not mean we're getting rid of, you know, like all systems of accountability or protection or something like that. It just means thinking about stuff a little differently. So Angela Davis would be a really good person to look into.
Can I let people know the City Club had a program that there's now a pilot program where I guess the 911 people determine that certain calls are not requiring police, and they're doing a program through the fire department, you know, which most people like firemen, sending a car with an EMT and you know, some kind of counselor, or, you know, when homeless, you know, somebody calls up and says there's somebody behaving strangely in my neighborhood, to get it out of the police system.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that, Kathy. I'm afraid we're out of time for the formal part of our program. We will be hanging on after for those that want to continue the discussion. We certainly can. Kellye, thank you so much for a really timely discussion. I learned a lot today, and I just want to thank you for your willingness to share your knowledge. And you've been studying. When Stephen talked about all the work that you've done to educate yourself. Thank you. Thank you for the work that you've done.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Kellye.
Yeah.
Thank you.